The sun beat down hard, casting long, crooked shadows across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek. A crowd was gathering for what might just be the most shameful auction folks had ever seen. The Montana Territory had seen some things, but not like this, not in the summer of 1878. Margaret Flynn stood shaken on that rickety platform, holding on tight to her 6-month-old boy, William, right against her heart. Her eyes showed a fire of defiance and a whole lot of fear as the auctioneer got ready to sell them off like cattle, all to settle her husband's debts after he'd passed. You could feel the tension in the air, thick as molasses. Margaret stood tall, her pretty chestnut hair peeking out from under her bonnet. Even covered in trail dust, you could see she was a fine woman, despite the terrible fix she was in. Little William, well, he didn't know a thing about their awful situation. He just cooed a little, nestled against his mama's worn-out calico dress. The crowd was a mix of folks, miners, ranchers, and townspeople. Some looked down at their boots in shame. Others were busy calculating just what a young widow and her baby boy might be worth to them. "All right, folks," the banker Celis Turner called out. "As the man in charge of Patrick Flynn's estate, it's my job to settle his mighty large debts." He was the one who cooked up this whole dreadful affair. "Here we have his widow and child. She's a strong woman, good for cooking, cleaning, and whatever other chores you might have in mind." The nasty way he said it made Margaret feel sick to her stomach. "The bidding will start at $50 for the pair." Now, Miles Sutton had been riding for 3 straight days, hardly stopping for his poor, tired buckskin horse. He'd heard about this auction from a fella passing through who spoke of it with pure disgust. And something deep in Miles's gut told him he had to get to Redemption Creek, and fast. He was a quiet man who didn't get attached to much of anything, a drifter since the war. He'd spent the last 10 years moving from one ranch to the next all over the West. At 32, his face was carved when the sun and tough times. His dark brown hair had some silver showing up early at the sides. Just as the bidding hit $75, Miles nudged his horse on through, parting the silent crowd. He showed up right when a big, rough-looking miner hollered out a bid of $85, looking at Margaret in a way that made her pull her sweet baby even closer. $100, a low, steady voice boomed from the back. The crowd turned as one to see who spoke. Miles sat tall on his dust-caked horse. His blue eyes were calm and steady under the brim of his well-worn Stetson, and he swung down from the saddle, smooth as you please, despite being clearly bone-tired. "Hold on there, mister, we're about to close this out," Turner griped. "This fellow right here has bid $85. But Miles just kept walking toward that platform, every step of his boots landing firm in the sudden quiet. $100, he said again, his voice full of a quiet power. "And I will be taking them right now." Turner stalled, glancing from Miles over to the miner who had been making the bids. "Sir, I can't say I know your face." "The name is Miles Sutton, and the money is right here in my hand." He drew a small leather pouch from his vest. $100 in gold coin, enough to cover the debt. Turner ran his tongue over his dry lips. "Well now, the actual debt is $120, Miles cut him right off, adding more coins to the stack he had already put on the auctioneer's table. "That ought to settle things." For the very first time since he rode up, Miles let his eyes finally meet Margaret's. And what he saw in them, a mix of pure fear, hope, and a mother's fierce need to protect, it stirred something deep inside him he thought was long dead and buried. "Going once," Turner called out, not sounding too happy about it. "Going twice." "Sold to Mr. Sutton." The crowd started to whisper as Miles walked up the steps to the platform. When he got up close, he could see that Margaret was younger than he had first figured, maybe just 23 or 24. Her big green eyes were shining with tears she was fighting to hold back. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low as he tipped his hat, "if you and the boy would please come with me." Margaret swallowed hard against a lump in her throat. "Why?" she whispered, her voice so quiet you could hardly hear it. "Why would a stranger do this?" Miles looked around at the crowd that was breaking up, knowing full well that plenty of eyes were still on them. "Not out here," he said quietly. "I have a room over at the boarding house. We can talk in private there." She lifted her chin just a little. "And how am I to know your intentions are any better than theirs?" A faint smile barely touched his lips. You do not, but I give you my solemn word as a gentleman. No harm will come to you or your boy while you are under my protection." He paused for a moment, then said, "I knew your husband." Margaret's eyes shot wide open at that, and after taking a second to let that sink in, she gave a small, slow nod. With all the dignity she could find, she let Miles help her down from that awful platform. He gathered up his horse's reins and started leading them both toward the boarding house, feeling the heavy weight of the promise he had just made. Little William started to fuss a bit, so Margaret gently bounced him in her arms. "It's gonna be all right, my sweet boy," she whispered, though you could hear the worry plain as day in her own voice. The boarding house was a simple two-story building with white paint peeling off in spots. Mrs. Abernathy, the lady who ran the place, raised her eyebrows when Miles walked in with a woman and a baby, but she kept her peace as he asked for another room for Margaret. "I'm afraid we're all full up, Mr. Sutton," Mrs. Abernathy told him, "especially with all the cattle buyers in town." Miles just nodded, not at all surprised that a small town like this was booked solid. "Well then, I'll take a cot in the storage room. Mrs. Flynn can have my room." Once they got upstairs, Miles unlocked the door to his small but clean room and stepped aside to let Margaret go in first. She paused right there into the doorway, holding William just a little tighter. "I won't be staying," Miles told her gently. "I just figured you might want a private place to sit while we sort things out." Margaret nodded and walked right in, looking around at the simple furniture. A narrow bed, a washstand, and a small table with just one single chair. Miles stayed by the open door, giving her some space. "You said you knew Patrick," she began, sitting down on the edge of the bed. Miles leaned against the doorframe and took off his hat. "We rode together back in the war, but we lost track of each other after. I just heard he'd settled down out this way." "You fought for the Union?" she asked. Miles nodded. "Pennsylvania 7th Cavalry. Patrick was a good fella, a brave soldier." Margaret's eyes started to well up with tears. "He was a good husband, too, until—" Her voice faded as she gently rocked William, who was getting fussy again. "Until what, Mrs. Flynn?" he asked softly. She let out a long, heavy sigh. "The gambling, the drinking, it all started small. But after our William was born, it just got a whole lot worse. I had no idea how bad his debts were until the fever took him about 3 months back." She looked right up at Miles, her eyes suddenly fierce. "But he loved us. Whatever his faults were, I know he loved us." Miles nodded slowly. He understood that the friend he once knew was more complicated than he ever imagined. "I find that hard to believe. So what happens now, Mr. Sutton? Have I just traded one owner for another?" Her question was sharp, and Miles respected her for it. "No, ma'am. I have a small ranch about a 2-day ride from here. It is not anything fancy, but it is peaceful. You and your boy can stay there until you figure out what you want to do. I will help you get on your feet." Margaret sized him up, her eyes full of suspicion. "And what are you expecting in return?" "Nothing." When she looked like she did not believe him, he added, "I owed Patrick. Consider this me paying that debt. A man does not do something for nothing, Mr. Sutton." A faint smile touched Miles's lips. "Well, maybe I am not like most men." He straightened his back. "Get some rest, Mrs. Flynn. We will be leaving at first light tomorrow, if that is all right with you." As he turned to walk away, Margaret called out to him, "Mr. Sutton, thank you. Whatever your reasons are, I thank you." Miles gave a single nod and closed the door behind him, leaving Margaret all alone with her thoughts and her sweet baby boy. As he made his way to the storage room where he would be sleeping for the night, he wondered what in the world possessed him to take on a widow and her child. He had spent the last 10 years dodging any kind of entanglement, moving on whenever roots threatened to take hold. And yet, there was something about Margaret Flynn's fiery spirit in the face of such shame that had stirred something in him. And then there was little William. Miles always had a soft spot for children, though he never figured he would have any of his own. Perhaps it was just that no decent man could stand by and watch a woman and her child be sold off like a couple of cattle. Whatever the reason, Miles knew his quiet, lonesome life had just gotten a whole lot more complicated. Dawn broke, and golden light streamed through the small window of Margaret's borrowed room. She had hardly slept a wink, going back and forth between nursing William and wondering about the mysterious cowboy who had bought them right off that auction block. Miles Sutton was a real puzzle. He was rough around the edges, but his voice was gentle. He was an intimidating man, but he was careful in all his movements. The most puzzling part was his claim that he wanted nothing in return for his help. Margaret had learned the hard way that a man's generosity usually came with a hidden price tag. Patrick had been charming and generous in the beginning. Back when he was courting her, he'd bring her little gifts and make all sorts of grand promises. It was only after they were married that she found out he had a real weakness for gambling. He'd bet away their small savings and then drown his losses in whiskey. But she had loved him. She kept on trying to see the good man she married under all that trouble, but his passing left her not just with a broken heart, but with nothing to her name. William started to fuss in the little crib she'd made from a drawer, his tiny fists just waving in the air. Margaret scooped him up, breathing in that sweet baby smell. "What do you reckon, my little man?" she whispered. "Can we put our trust in Mr. Sutton?" A soft knock on the door broke her train of thought. She quickly straightened her dress after feeding William and called out, "Come on in." Miles walked in, already dressed for the trail in a faded blue shirt and dusty denims, his gun belt hanging low on his hips. He was carrying a small bundle. "Mrs. Abernathy sent up some breakfast," he said, setting the bundle on the table. He unwrapped it to show biscuits, jerky, and a little jar of preserves. "And this here," he held up a small can of sweet milk. She figured the baby might be needing it on the journey. Margaret was truly touched by their kindness. "Thank you kindly, and please, call me Margaret. It feels mighty strange to be so formal with the fella who bought us." Miles flinched a little when she said that. "I did not buy you, Margaret. I paid off a debt that was wrongly put on you and your boy. There is a big difference." She gave a small smile. "Is there? Either way, I reckon I'm in your debt now." "You are not in my debt for anything except doing what is best for you and William." He nodded toward the baby. "He is a fine-looking little fella. How old is he?" "He'll be 6 months next week." She paused. "Would you like to hold him?" Miles looked taken aback by the offer, then a little unsure. "I do not have much experience with little ones." "It is not hard. Just support his head and his bottom." She stood up and carefully passed William into Miles's arms, showing him where to put his hands. Miles stood stiff as a board at first, clearly worried about hurting the little fella. But William just gazed right up at him with curious blue eyes. Slowly but surely, Miles began to relax, and a warm smile softened his weathered face. "Well, howdy there, little fella," he said in a low voice. Margaret watched them, curious. There was a kindness in Miles Sutton that did not quite match his rough and tumble look. Little William seemed to pick up on it, too, as he did not make a peep while being held by the stranger. "Reckon we ought to get a move on," Miles said, hesitating a bit before handing William back to Margaret. "It is a far piece to my spread, and I would sure like to cover some ground before that sun gets too high." Margaret nodded, taking stock of her few remaining possessions. "It will not take me long. I do not have much to pack. Just what I could grab when they ran us off our land." A fire sparked in Miles's eyes. Looked a lot like anger, but he banked it down quick. "Mrs. Abernathy rustled up some things for the baby, and I went ahead and got us a wagon instead of us riding horses. I figured it would be a whole lot easier on you and the little one." Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest at his thoughtfulness. "Thank you." About an hour later, they were rolling out of Redemption Creek, with Miles handling the reins and Margaret and William sitting right beside him. Her worldly possessions fit in a small bundle: 2 dresses, a shawl, William's little blanket, and a locket that held a curl of her late husband's hair. Miles had added some supplies from the general store, some grub, nappies for William, and a few other things they would need. As the dusty town shrank in the distance behind them, Margaret felt a mix of fear and, strangely enough, relief. She was leaving the place that held all her best memories and her worst heartbreak, heading toward a future she could not rightly see, with a man who was still a stranger to her. But somehow, sitting next to Miles Sutton, watching his steady hands on the reins, she felt a sense of safety she had not known in months. "Tell me about your place," she said, once they had settled into the rhythm of the road. Miles kept his gaze on the trail ahead. "It is not much to brag on. Just 100 acres nestled in the foothills. A small cabin, a barn, and a corral. I am running about 30 head of cattle and a few horses I am gentling to sell. And you are out there all by yourself? He nodded. I had a ranch hand last season, but he got the itch for California. I have been handling it all myself since then. It sounds peaceful. A faint smile pulled at the corner of his mouth. That it is. It was quiet, almost too quiet sometimes. They settled into a comfortable silence as the wagon rumbled along through the rugged Montana country. That July sun was beating down on them, but a little breeze kept the heat from being too much. Little William slept soundly against Margaret's chest, rocked to sleep by the steady sway of the wagon. May I ask you something, Mr. Sutton? Miles, he corrected her gently. And yes, ma'am, you surely can. What brought you to Redemption Creek? You mentioned hearing about that auction, but who told you and why did you care enough to come? Miles stayed quiet for so long, Margaret figured he was not going to answer at all. Then finally he spoke, his voice real low. I was over in Billings, delivering some horses, when I ran into a fellow who had just come from Redemption Creek. He told me about the auction, said it was not a right thing to do, selling a woman and her baby, and he said the woman's name was Flynn. Miles tightened his gripping on the reins. Patrick saved my life back in the war. He took a bullet that had my name on it at Chickamauga. I reckoned if his widow was in a tight spot, I owed him a debt to help her out. Margaret let that sink in. That is a very honorable thing to do. Miles just shrugged, just doing what needed to be done. They stopped around noon to give the horses a rest and have a simple meal themselves, eating jerky, biscuits, and some dried apples. Margaret took the chance to feed and change little William, moving off to a shady spot behind the wagon for some privacy. When she came back, she saw Miles filling a canteen from a little stream. This water is fresh and clear, he said, holding the canteen out to her. We will make camp a few hours up the trail, near Willow Creek. I know a good sheltered spot there. Margaret nodded. She was mighty grateful for his know-how. She had never been far from town before, and this wide-open country was both beautiful and a little bit scary. As they rode on, Margaret found herself studying Miles when he was not looking. There was a deep sadness about him, a loneliness that seemed to go clear to the bone. She wondered what all had happened in the years since the war to put those lines around his eyes, and to put that tired look deep in his gaze. By late in the afternoon, dark clouds started gathering on the horizon, and a cool wind had kicked up, replacing that gentle breeze. A storm is coming, Saul Miles said, looking up at the sky. We might not make it to Willow Creek before she breaks loose. Right on cue, a low rumble of thunder rolled in from way out on the plains. Little William stirred, letting out a soft whimper at the sound. There's an old line shack about a mile up yonder, Miles said. It is not much, but it is solid. We can shelter in there. The rain started just as that little wooden shack came into sight. Big old drops that turned into a real gully wash her in no time. Miles pushed the horses a little faster, pulling up next to the shack just as lightning cracked open the sky. Y'all wait here, he said, hopping down from the wagon. He gave the inside of the shack a quick look-see before coming back for Margaret and William. It is empty, a little dusty, but it is dripped in. He helped Margaret down, then grabbed their things while she hurried on into the shelter with little William. The shack was sure enough dusty, but the bones of it were good, with a small stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, and a skinny cot pushed up against one wall. Miles carried in their provisions, then he went right back into that storm to see to the horses and tie down the wagon. When he came back in, he was soaked clear through, with his dark hair stuck to his forehead. Found a stack of old firewood out back, he said, dropping an armful down by the fireplace. Ought to be dry enough to catch. Margaret had already laid a blanket on the floor for William, who was happily kicking his little legs in the air. Here, let me give you a hand with that fire, she offered. You are soaked to the bone. Together they got a small fire going that soon cast a warm, friendly glow all around that little one-room shack. Outside, the storm got meaner, with rain whipping the windows and thunder booming right over their heads. Miles took off his wet coat and hung it near the fire, then sat down at the table to pull off his wet boots. Margaret kept herself busy, sorting their supplies and fixing a simple supper of beans, jerky, and the last few of Mrs. Abernathy's biscuits. It is not much, I am afraid, she said with an apology, setting a plate down for him. It is more than fine, he told her. A whole lot better than what I usually scrape together for myself. They ate without a lot of talk, but it was a comfortable quiet, with the fire crackling and the rain drumming on the roof. The only other sound was little William cooing every now and then. For the first time in what felt like forever, Margaret felt herself start to unwind. Now, it wasn't much to look at, but there was something mighty comforting about that small shack, with a warm fire going and the steady presence of Miles sitting right across from her. After they had eaten, Miles was firm about it. Margaret would take the cot with William, and he would sleep on his bedroll near the fire. As she settled little William beside her, wrapping him up snug in his blanket, Margaret watched Miles spread his bedroll on the floorboards. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Miles looked up, his blue eyes reflecting the fire's light. "No need for thanks, ma'am." "Oh, but there is. You could have just kept on riding. I reckon most men would have." He was quiet for a moment. "Get some sleep, Margaret. We've got another long day of travel tomorrow." Margaret lay awake for a good long while after Miles had stretched out on his bedroll, his breathing becoming steady and deep. The storm raged on outside, but inside the shack, everything was peaceful. William slept soundly next to her, his tiny hand curled right up against her arm. For the very first time since Patrick's death, Margaret allowed herself to feel a sliver of hope for a future that was more than just surviving. She had no idea what was waiting for them at Miles Sutton's ranch, but she was beginning to believe it might be a place where she and William could finally start to heal, and maybe even find a good life. With that one thought, she finally drifted off to sleep, soothed by the rain and the quiet strength of that mysterious cowboy who, for reasons she still couldn't quite figure out, had decided to save them. The storm passed on through the night, leaving behind a world all washed clean and glittering in the morning sunlight. Margaret woke up to find Miles was already up and about, tending to the horses just outside. William was still sleeping so peacefully beside her, his sweet little face all calm and relaxed in his sleep. She quickly washed up using the basin of water Miles had thoughtfully left for her. Then she changed into her only other dress, a faded blue calico that had surely seen better days, but it was clean and still had some good wear in it. By the time Miles came back inside, she had gotten the fire going again and was warming up the last little bit of their coffee. "Good morning," she greeted him with a small smile. "Coffee is almost ready." Miles nodded his thanks, taking off his hat as he stepped through the door. "The trail's a mite muddy from the rain, but it'll do. We ought to reach the ranch by sundown if we keep a good pace." They had themselves a quick breakfast of hardtack and dried fruit, then got everything packed up, their gear. While Margaret was gathering up William's things, Miles went and surprised her by gently lifting the now awake baby boy. "Well, good morning, little fella," he said, his deep voice all soft like. "You ready for another day on this trail?" William let out a happy little gurgle, reaching up to grab at the scruff on Miles's chin. Miles let out a chuckle, a warm sound that completely changed his usually serious face. Margaret just watched them, feeling a mix of surprise and a little bit of joy. Her late husband Patrick had been a distant father, to say the least, always awkward around William and quick to find an excuse to leave the room when he started to cry. Seeing how natural Miles was with her son was both heartwarming and a little painful too, a reminder of the man Patrick might have become if he had lived to really get to know his own son. They headed out under a big, clear blue sky, with the wagon wheels getting stuck in a muddy patch every now and then, but they still made steady headway. As the day stretched on, the land itself started to change, with the flat plains giving way to rolling hills all dotted with pine and aspen trees. Come mid-afternoon, you could see mountains way off in the distance, their peaks still covered in snow, even with the summer heat. "That right there is the northern edge of the Gallatin Range," Miles explained, seeing how Margaret was looking. "My place is tucked right in the foothills, just where that line of pine trees starts to climb." Margaret tried to picture herself living in a place like that, so different from the dusty streets of Redemption Creek or the packed-in Boston neighborhood where she grew up. "It is beautiful," she admitted to herself, "but a whole lot wilder than I am used to." "It grows on you," Miles said. "All this space, the quiet." He glanced over at her. "Though I reckon it might feel a little too quiet after living in town." "After these last few months, quiet sounds like heaven," Margaret replied. her mind on all the constant whispers and the judging stares that followed her everywhere after Patrick died. And after everyone found out about all the debts he left, they pulled over for a little while at a clear-running stream to let the horses drink and to stretch their own legs. Little William started fussing, getting hungry, and plain tired of all the jostling, so Margaret found a nice shady spot to nurse him while Miles refilled their canteens. "How much farther is it?" she asked when he walked back. "Another 3 or 4 hours, I reckon. We will need to stop. Again before we get there. Let these horses have a good rest." Margaret just nodded her head, gently patting little William's back. "He has been so good considering everything. He has barely made a peep." "He is a strong boy," Miles said, looking over. "Takes after his mother." That compliment, spoken so plainly, truly caught Margaret by surprise. She had spent months hearing only harsh words and pity from all the folks in town. To be called strong instead of pitiful felt like a cool drink of water. "I am not so sure about that," she said in a quiet voice. "If I was truly strong, maybe we would not have ended up on that awful auction block." Miles's brow furrowed. "That was not your fault. That was Turner and his kind, just taking advantage of a terrible situation. Still, I should have found some other way." "What other was a game?" Miles asked her. "From what I heard, they took your home and everything you owned. You had a new baby to care for with no family to help you. Do not be so hard on yourself, Margaret." His words were a bit rough around the edges, but kind. They loosened a knot deep inside Margaret's chest. She had not even realized how much she had been carrying the blame for their whole situation. They rode on, the land getting rougher and rockier as they got closer to the foothills. The late afternoon sun slanted down through the growing stands of pine trees, making long shadows stretch across the trail. William had drifted off to sleep against his mother's chest, his one tiny hand tangled up in a lock of her hair. "There it is," Miles said, just as they came over a small rise. "Home." Down below them, nestled right in a clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees, sat a simple cabin with a stone chimney. A little ways off stood a barn and a corral where a few horses were grazing peacefully. A small creek wound its way through the property with willow trees lining its banks. It was a simple place, but it was truly beautiful, all bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. "Oh," Margaret breathed out, "it is just lovely." A pleased look crossed Miles's face when he heard her. "It is not much, but it is peaceful." They started making their way down the gentle slope toward the cabin. As they got closer, Margaret started to see little details she had missed from up on the hill. A small vegetable garden off to one side of the cabin, a wood pile stacked up just so against the barn, and a rocking chair on the front porch. All signs of a life that was carefully put together. Miles pulled the wagon to a stop right in front of the cabin and helped Margaret down before he went to see about the horses. She just stood there for a moment, soaking in the quiet beauty of the place. The only sounds were the soft nickering of horses in the corral, the gentle burble of the creek, and the wind sighing through the pines. "Let me show you inside," Miles said, coming back from unhitching the team. He carried their few belongings as he led the way up to the cabin. The inside was simple, but you could tell it was well made. One main room with a stone fireplace, a wooden table with 4 chairs, a rocking chair by the fire, and a few shelves holding books and the things they needed to get by. A doorway led to what looked like a bedroom, and a ladder leaning against one wall suggested there was a loft space up above. "It is not fancy," Miles said, suddenly sounding a little self-conscious. "But it is solid. It keeps out the winter cold." "It is wonderful," Margaret assured him, and she meant every word. After months of not knowing and the humiliation of having her home taken, the simple cabin felt like a safe harbor. Miles showed her to the bedroom. "You and William can have this room. I will take the loft." Margaret started to argue. It was his home after all, but the look on his face told her it would be no use. Instead, she simply gave him a heartfelt thank you. The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a bed covered in a lovely handmade quilt, a small chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the creek. Miles set her bag on the chest, and then he paused. "I will get supper started while you get settled," he offered. "It will not be anything special, but it will be hot." Left alone with a sleeping William, Margaret took a moment to just breathe and collect herself. The things that happened the past few days had been so overwhelming, from the awful horror of the auction to this completely unexpected rescue. Miles Sutton was still a complete puzzle to her. His kindness just did not match with how much he clearly wanted to be left alone. Why would a man like that take on the huge responsibility of a widow and her baby? She settled William on the bed, surrounding him with pillows to prevent him from rolling off, then took a moment to wash her face and hands in the basin Miles had provided. Her reflection in the small mirror above the chest showed a woman both familiar and strange. Her features the same, but her eyes holding a weariness that hadn't been there a year ago. When she returned to the main room, she found Miles at the stove cooking what smelled like venison stew. He'd removed his hat and coat, and with his sleeves rolled up, revealing muscular forearms, he looked more at ease than she'd seen him yet. "Can I help?" she offered. He glanced up. "There's bread in that bin if you want to slice some." They worked together in companionable silence, and soon a simple but hearty meal was on the table. Margaret checked on William, who was still sleeping soundly before joining Miles. "He's exhausted from the journey," she explained. "I should probably wake him to eat, but I hate to disturb him when he's sleeping so peacefully." "Let him rest," Miles suggested. "He'll let you know when he's hungry." The stew was surprisingly good, rich with vegetables from Miles's garden and tender venison. Margaret found herself hungrier than she'd realized, accepting a second helping when Miles offered it. "This is delicious," she complimented. "You're quite the cook." A hint of color touched his cheekbones. "When you live alone, you either learn to cook or eat poorly." "How long have you been here?" she asked, curious about the life he'd built. "6 years. He broke off a piece of bread, bought the place after drifting for a while after the war. It was barely standing then. The previous owner had let it go to ruin. Spent the first year just making it livable." "You've done a remarkable job," Margaret said, looking around at the well-constructed cabin. "It feels like a home." Something flickered in Miles' eyes. Pleasure at the compliment, perhaps, or something deeper. "It suits me," he said simply. As they ate, Margaret found herself telling Miles about her life before Patrick, growing up in Boston, the daughter of a school teacher, her dreams of becoming a school teacher herself right before she met that charming man from Ireland who would steal her heart. "Oh, Patrick had such grand plans," she recalled with a soft voice. "He swore he was going to strike it rich in the goldfields, then start up his own business. We were fixing to have a fine house in town and a half-dozen children." A sad smile touched her lips. "Dreams sure do fade fast out in this country, don't they?" Miles just nodded, his eyes full of understanding. He knew exactly what she meant. The West has a way of stripping a person right down to what is true and real. For some folks, that is unbearable. For others, it is a kind of freedom. "And you? Which one was it for you?" He took a moment to think on it. A little of both, at different times, but mostly freedom now. Just then a cry from the bedroom broke the quiet conversation. "You will have to excuse me," Margaret said, getting up from her chair to check on little William. When she returned with the now wide-awake baby, Miles had already cleared the table and was tending the fire, building it up against the evening chill. Little William was all wide-eyed, just taking in this new place with all the curiosity a baby can have. "There is some fresh milk cooling by the window," Miles told her. "Got it fresh this morning, before I headed out. From my own cows in the barn. You are welcome too as much as you need, as long as you all are here." "Thank you," Margaret whispered, settling into the rocking chair. So grateful for his kindness. "This is more than I ever could have hoped for, you know, after what they did, putting us up on that platform." She had to swallow hard, the memory still so raw and painful. "I truly thought William and I were lost for good." Miles sat across from her, his face looking serious in the flickering firelight. "No one should ever have to go through something like that, especially not Patrick's wife and his son. The debt was real. I will not deny it," Margaret admitted. "I am not arguing that part. But the way they went about collecting it," she just shook her head in disbelief, "treating us like we were property, not people." "That man Turner has had this coming for a long, long time," Miles said, and a hard, cold edge had come into his voice. "He has torn apart more than one family around here with his dirty schemes." They sat there in a heavy silence for a long while. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and William's soft gurgles as he took in his new world from the safety of his dear mother's lap. A comfortable quiet settled between them, which surprised Margaret. It was as if they had known each other for much longer than just a couple of days. Before long, little William started to fuss, getting ready for his supper and his bed. Margaret excused herself once more, returning to the bedroom to nurse the little fella and get him settled for the night. When she came back out, Miles was on the porch, smoking a cigarette and looking up at the stars that were popping out in the clear night sky. "He's asleep now," she said, her voice soft as she joined him. "Once he's down for the count, he usually sleeps a good long while." Miles just nodded, motioning for her to take the rocking chair while he leaned back against the porch rail. The night air was cool but felt good, with a whole chorus of crickets chirping and an old owl hooting every now and then, making a real peaceful sound. "It is so peaceful out here," Marguerite said, taking it all in. "I can surely see why you picked this spot." Miles tapped the ash off his cigarette. "After the war, I just could not stand being around a whole mess of people. All that noise, the demands, it was just too much. Out here, a man can finally breathe." "And what about a woman?" Margaret asked. "Can she breathe out here too?" Miles looked over at her, his face thoughtful in the soft light spilling out from the cabin windows. "Well, I reckon that all depends on the woman." Margaret smiled. "I suppose it does," she said, rocking gently as she thought things over. "I will not be a burden to you, Miles. I know how to cook and clean, and I can mend clothes just fine. I am a whole lot stronger than I look, and once William gets a little bigger, I will find a way to make my own living." "There is no rush," Miles said. "You are welcome to stay here as long as you need to." "I meant every word I said. I owed Patrick." Margaret looked at him, really studied him. "Was it a big enough debt for you to feel this obliged?" Miles was quiet for a good long moment. "He did more than just take that bullet. Afterwards, when I was laid up recovering, he was the one who wrote to my folks. He told them I was alive when they had already been told I was dead. Gave them hope when they did not have any left." He looked out into the dark. "That is the kind of debt that does not just go away when a man dies." The pure depth of his loyalty truly touched Margaret. She was starting to see that underneath Miles Sutton's quiet outside was a man with some real deep principle and honor. "Still," she insisted, "I want to pull my own weight. It is important to me." Miles nodded, respecting her grit. "All right, we will figure something out." He put out his cigarette. "It is getting late, and you have had a long road to get here. You ought to get some rest." Margaret stood up, suddenly feeling just how bone-tired she was. "Good night, Miles, and truly thank you again." "Night, Margaret." Walking back to the bedroom, Margaret was just amazed at how quickly this place had started to feel like a safe harbor. She hardly knew Miles Sutton at all, but she trusted him deep down in a way she just could not put into words. Maybe it was just that after all those months of hard stares and judgment back in Redemption Creek, his quiet goodness felt like a cool drink of water. Whatever the reason, as she laid there next to William in that comfortable bed, listening to the soft night sounds of the ranch, Margaret felt something stir inside her that she had not felt in the longest time. It was hope. The days soon settled into a gentle, easy rhythm there on the Sutton Ranch. Now Margaret, she was used to running a household, and she quickly took to the house chores, cooking up meals that were a whole lot tastier than Miles's bachelor cooking, and keeping the cabin neat and tidy. Miles, he spent his days out tending to the cattle, breaking horses, and keeping the place up. But he always found a moment to check in on Margaret and little William during the day. That boy, William, just thrived in the clean mountain air, getting stronger and more bright-eyed with every sunrise. He had started pulling himself up, just raring to explore this new world of his, and Miles had gone and built him a simple wooden playpen to keep him safe while Margaret had her hands full with chores. One morning, about 2 weeks after they had arrived, Margaret was out hanging laundry on a line stretched between two pine trees when she caught Miles watching her from over by the corral. He looked away real quick when their eyes met, turning his attention right back to the young mare he was working with. Margaret could not help but smile, finding his bashful streak mighty endearing in a man so capable. She had been learning more about him during their talks by the fire each evening. Turns out, he was the youngest of four boys from a farming family back in Pennsylvania, and he had fought in most of the big battles of the war. Afterwards, he had spent years just drifting west, working on ranches all the way from Kansas to Wyoming, before he finally put down roots into Montana. He did not talk much about the war itself, but Margaret could tell it had left scars deeper than the one you could see running down his left arm. But what really got to her was his natural, easy way with little William. Every single evening, he would hold that baby. While Margaret was fixing supper, talking to him in a soft, easy voice about everything that happened on the ranch that day, little William had started reaching for Miles every time he walked in the room, a change that seemed to make the cowboy happy and a little puzzled too. As July bled on into August, the days got hotter, though the evenings stayed real pleasant and cool. Miles had started teaching Margaret how to ride on his calmest mare, a pretty dappled gray he called Willow. Now Margaret had never been real comfortable on a horse, but with Miles teaching her so patiently, she was starting to feel more sure of herself. "Well, you're a natural at this," he told her as they rode easy-like along the creek one evening. "You just need to loosen up them shoulders a little bit." Margaret straightened up a bit and felt the difference right away. Little William was tucked all safe and sound in a sling on her chest, just happily watching the world go by from his new spot. "This is not nearly as scary as I thought it would be," she admitted. "But I doubt I will ever be as good as you." Miles just chuckled at that. "Well, I have been riding since before I could walk. You are doing just fine for a city girl." He said it with a friendly tease in his voice, nothing mean, and Margaret just smiled right back. Well, this city girl surely appreciates the lesson. They rode on in a comfortable quiet for a little while, just soaking in the beauty of the early evening. The setting sun painted everything in a golden light, making the creek look like a ribbon of fire. Off in the distance, a doe and her little fawn stepped out from the trees to get a drink, not bothered by them one bit. "It is like we are living inside a painting," Margaret said softly. "I never knew a place this beautiful even existed." Miles looked over at her, a real warmth in his eyes. "Neither did I, once upon a time." That moment hung there between them, full of things they did not need to say. Then little William broke the spell by grabbing a big handful of Willow's mane, which made the horse toss her head in surprise. "Whoa there, little fella," Miles said with a soft laugh, reaching over to gently pry the baby's little fingers loose. "Now that is not polite horse manners," Margaret laughed. "He is turning into quite the little adventurer. Just yesterday, I caught him trying to climb right out of his cradle." "He has got spunk," Miles said, sounding mighty pleased. "He is going to make a fine horseman one day." The unspoken question of William's future on the ranch just hung there in the quiet between them. They both knew the situation was not permanent, but neither one had dared to speak of how or when it might all come to an end. As they started walking back to the cabin, Miles finally brought up something that had been weighing on his mind. That Founders Day celebration is coming up in Whitefish Creek next Saturday. "I was thinking you might like to go, get out for a spell, and meet some of the neighbors." Margaret was taken aback by the invitation. "I would surely like that. But are you certain? Little William can get a bit fussy in a crowd. Folks around here are used to babies," Miles assured him. "Besides, it might do you some good to talk to someone other than this old cowboy." "You are hardly old," Margaret protested gently, "and I truly enjoy your company." A faint touch of color rose on Miles's cheekbones. "Well, all the same, I just figured you might enjoy a day in town. There will be music, some dancing, and plenty of good food." "It sounds absolutely wonderful," Margaret said, her voice full of sincerity. Then a practical worry crossed her mind. "But I do not have a single thing that is suitable to wear. This dress and my other one are hardly right for a celebration." Miles thought on that for a moment. "Mrs. Caldwell down at the general store might just have something. We can head into town tomorrow if you would like. See what she has available." Margaret nodded, touched by his quiet thoughtfulness. "I would appreciate that very much." The small town of Whitefish Creek was a world away from Redemption Creek. It was cleaner, more prosperous, with a true sense of community, not like that desperate, hard-scrabble feeling that had hung over her former home. The general store was stocked to the rafters, and Mrs. Caldwell, a plump, cheerful woman in her 50s, greeted Miles warmly. "Well, Miles Sutton, as I live and breathe, I have not seen you in a coon's age." Her curious eyes then fell on Margaret and William. And who might these fine folks be? This here is Mrs. Margaret Flynn and her son, William. Miles made the introductions. They are staying out at my place for a spell. Margaret, this is Ida Caldwell. She knows everything about everyone for 20 miles in any direction. Mrs. Caldwell let out a hearty laugh. Oh, do not you listen to him, dear. I just take a friendly interest in my neighbors. That is all. She reached her arms out for William, who was watching her with big, wide eyes. May I? Margaret handed her son over, and he immediately grabbed for Mrs. Caldwell's shiny brooch. Glasses. Now you be careful. He is a quick little grabber these days. Oh, I have raised 5 of my own children. I know all about those quick little hands. Mrs. Caldwell bounced William like she had done it 1,000 times. Now, what can I do for y'all today? Miles told her they were needing a new dress for the Founders' Day celebration, and Mrs. Caldwell's whole face just lit right up. Oh, I have the perfect thing for you. It just came in on the last shipment from back east. I have not found the right person for it yet. Most of the ladies around these parts sew their own dresses, you know. She led Margaret over to a corner of the shop where a few ready-made dresses were hanging on display. And right there among them was a beautiful blue calico dress with white trim, simple but a whole lot more elegant than Margaret's own worn-out clothes. Oh, it is just beautiful, Margaret whispered, running her hand over the soft fabric. Well, go on and try it on, Mrs. Caldwell urged, nodding toward a little changing area in the back. I will keep an eye on this little fella for you. That dress fit like it was made just for her, the blue making the green in her eyes sparkle, and the cut of it showed off her slim figure. When she stepped out from behind that curtain, both Mrs. Caldwell and Miles just stood there and stared. Oh, my word, Mrs. Caldwell said with a big smile. That is absolutely perfect on you. Miles did not say a word, but the look in his eyes said everything. Margaret felt a warmth spread all through her chest that had nothing to do with the Texas heat. We will take it, Miles said at last, pulling out his billfold. And we will take a ribbon to match, if you have one. Miles, that is too much, Margaret said quietly, knowing a dress like that cost a pretty penny. Just consider it a gift, he said, and his voice was firm. You have more than earned it with all the hard work you have been doing out at the ranch. Mrs. Caldwell took in the whole scene with great interest, her eyes twinkling behind her glasses as she started wrapping up the dress after Margaret had changed back into her old clothes. Then she started in on what Miles had warned Margaret was her favorite thing to do, which was gathering up all the local news. So, Mrs. Flynn, are you from around here originally? Margaret gave her the short version of her story, just saying that she was a widow and that her husband had passed from a fever. She did not say a thing about the auction, and she noticed Miles kept quiet about that part too. Well, why, welcome to Whitefish Creek, Mrs. Caldwell said with a warm smile. We're good folks here, not like in some of them rough and tumble mining towns, and Miles here is one of our finest men, though we don't see nearly enough of him. Miles looked a little flustered by the praise. Just keeping busy out at the ranch, Ida. You're too busy for your own good, she fussed at him gently. A man needs more than just work and horse to keep him company. Her knowing look between Miles and Margaret made it clear what she was getting at. On the ride back to the ranch, Margaret could not help but think about what Mrs. Caldwell had said. Had there been other women before her that Miles might have been sweet on? The thought brought a sudden pang of jealousy that she pushed right down. Miles had been nothing but a kind and honorable man. His past was his own affair. Mrs. Caldwell seems like a nice lady, she said as they followed the now familiar trail home. Miles just nodded. She is the salt of the earth. A little nosy, but her heart is in the right place. Her husband was the town's first mayor before he passed. She seems to think highly of you. A small smile played on his lips. The Caldwells helped me when I first set foot in these parts. Jim, he taught me about ranching in Montana. It is a whole different world from back east, and Ida made sure I did not go hungry that first winter. Margaret was touched, getting this little peek into Miles's first days in the territory. You have built a real good life for yourself here. I am trying to, he agreed. Some days are better than others. William, who had been snoozing soundly against Margaret's chest, woke up and started crying for his dinner. Miles immediately steered the wagon into a shady spot under a big old cottonwood tree. We can pull over here for a spell, he offered. Let you tend to the little fella in private. Margaret was always moved by how considerate he was. Patrick, for all his sweet talk, had never shown that kind of thought for her needs or for William's. As she nursed her boy in the cool shade of that tree, she found herself comparing the two men more and more. And Patrick usually came up short. She knew it was not fair. Not really. Patrick had been young, all caught up in his dreams of striking it rich. He had loved her in his own way, and she did not doubt he would have loved William if he had lived to know him better. But Miles's steady way, his quiet strength, his strength and steady support were showing her what a real partnership could be. And that thought, well, it was a troubling one. She'd been a widow for less than a year, living on Miles's goodwill. Any feelings past simple thankfulness and friendship just felt all kinds of wrong and could lead to a whole heap of trouble. But Lord, she couldn't deny the warmth that spread through her when he smiled, or the feeling like she belonged, moving around his cabin like it was her own home. As they kept on toward home, little William, happy as a clam, was babbling away, and Margaret made a promise to herself to guard her heart a little closer. Miles had offered them a safe harbor, not a romance. She'd best remember the difference. Founders Day in Whitefish Creek was every bit as wonderful as Miles said it would be. A real joyful get-together, bringing in families from all over the countryside. The whole town square was all decked out with streamers and lanterns, long tables, just groaning with food, lined one side, and a stage had been set up for the band, who were already playing some lively tunes when Miles, Margaret, and little William showed up. Margaret felt her stomach do a little flip as they walked up to the crowd. She hadn't been to a big social doings like this since way before Patrick passed, and never in a town where she didn't know a soul. But having Miles right there beside her, steady as a rock, was a comfort, and so was the weight of William in her arms. It kept her right here, in the now. "Miles Sutton!" a big voice boomed out. A tall fellow with a mustache you could be proud of came walking right toward them, with his hand stuck out. "I was beginning to think you weren't going to make it this year." "Wouldn't miss it for the world, Sheriff," Miles answered, shaking the man's hand. "Margaret, I'd like you to meet Sheriff Tom Dawson. Tom, this here is Mrs. Margaret Flynn and her son." "William," the sheriff gave a little tip of his hat to Margaret. "Ma'am, it's a real pleasure to meet you. That's a mighty fine-looking boy you got there." "Why, thank you, Sheriff," Margaret said, and she could feel herself relaxing just a bit at his friendly way. "If Miles is bringing you around, that must mean you're somebody special," the sheriff went on with a little wink. "That man hardly ever shows his face in town unless you drag him here at gunpoint." Miles looked a little red in the face. "Don't you pay him no mind, Margaret. Tom likes to stretch the truth." "Do I now?" The sheriff let out a big laugh. "Well, when was the last time you saw you at a social, Miles?" "Christmas of '76. "Well, I've been busy," Miles said, a little defensively, but there was no real heat to it. "Too busy for your own good, I'd say," Sheriff Dawson replied with a good-natured grin. "But it looks like you're making up for lost time tonight." He tipped his hat again. "Ma'am, Mrs. Flynn, I hope you enjoy our little town celebration. Y'all excuse me, duty's calling." And just like that, the sheriff moseyed on over to sort out a little fuss over by the punch bowl. Miles then gently guided Margaret toward the main gathering. "Sorry about that," he said under his breath. "Tom's a good fellow, but he can be a bit direct. Lacks what my own mother would call subtlety." Margaret just smiled. "I like him. He seems to genuinely care about you." "Well, most folks around here tend to look out for each other," Miles explained. "It's just the way of things in a place this rugged." They made their way deeper into the crowd, with Miles introducing Margaret to what felt like half the county. Every single introduction was friendly, though Margaret couldn't help but notice she caught a few curious glances and saw more than a few eyebrows raised at her being there with the rancher who usually kept to himself. Just then Mrs. Caldwell appeared, scooping up William for a big cuddle and insisting that Margaret and Miles go join in the dancing. For a moment, Margaret hesitated, but then Miles surprised her by holding out his hand. "Well, might as well give these folks something real to gossip about, he said, a rare grin spreading across his face. "That is, if you're willing." Margaret placed her hand in his, feeling a sudden little jolt of awareness at the simple touch. "I would be delighted, but I should warn you, I am terribly out of practice." "Well, that makes two of us," Miles admitted, leading her toward the floor where couples were already forming lines for a Virginia reel. But despite both of them claiming to be rusty, they moved together like they'd been partners for years. Miles was surprisingly light on his feet for such a big fella, and Margaret couldn't help but laugh as they twirled and stepped perfectly in time with the lively fiddle music. By the time the song ended, they were both a little bit breathless, and Margaret was very aware of the warm, steady feel of Miles's hand on her waist. "Not half bad for a couple of old homebodies," she teased. And that's when something shifted in Miles' eyes. A certain warmth, an openness she had never seen in him before. "No, ma'am, not bad at all." But the moment was broken by the arrival of a young woman who walked right up to Miles as if she'd known him forever. "Well, look at you, Miles," she said, her tone full of easy familiarity. "Out on the dance floor and everything. The world must be coming to an end." Miles turned, his warm expression tightening just a bit. "Hello? Rebecca, didn't know you were back in town." The young woman was perhaps 25, pretty in a delicate way with blonde hair and blue eyes. She looked at Margaret with undisguised curiosity. "Got back last month," she replied. "Pa's health isn't good." She extended a hand to Margaret. "Rebecca Wilson. My father owns the sawmill." "Margaret Flynn," Margaret replied, taking the offered hand. "Pleased to meet you." Rebecca's gaze moved between them, assessing, "How do you know our Miles?" There was a slight emphasis on "our" that made Margaret's spine stiffen. Before she could respond, Miles answered smoothly, "Margaret's husband was a war buddy of mine. She and William, her son, are staying at the ranch for a while." "How kind of you," Rebecca said, though her tone suggested she found it more puzzling than kind. "Always the gentleman, aren't you, Miles?" There was history there, Margaret realized. Perhaps a romantic history, given the way Rebecca was looking at Miles. The thought created an unexpected knot in her stomach. "Just doing what anyone would," Miles replied, his discomfort evident. "Hardly anyone," Rebecca corrected, then turned back to Margaret. "Has he shown you the falls yet? Most beautiful spot in the county. Miles used to take me there for picnics." The knot in Margaret's stomach tightened. Definitely a romantic history then. "We've been rather busy at the ranch," Margaret said, keeping her tone neutral. "Well, you must insist he take you. It's not to be missed." Rebecca touched Miles's arm familiarly. "Save me a dance later." Miles nodded, though without enthusiasm. "If you like." As Rebecca moved away, Miles let out a slow breath. "Sorry about that, old friend?" Margaret asked, aiming for casual and not entirely succeeding. Miles ran a hand through his hair. "Something like that. It was a while ago." Margaret wanted to ask more, but sensed his reluctance. Instead, she suggested they check on William, who was now surrounded by a group of admiring women, with Mrs. Caldwell proudly showing him off. The rest of the day passed pleasantly, though Margaret was more aware than ever of the curious glances and whispered conversations that followed them. Miles danced with Rebecca as promised, but he spent most of his time right there with Margaret, making sure she met more folks, and seeing to it that she and little William were comfortable. As the sun went down, folks started lighting lanterns all around the square, casting a warm glow over the party. A big bonfire was built right in the center of it all, and everyone gathered round to roast corn and apples over the flames. Little William had fallen fast asleep, right up against his mama's shoulder, plumb tuckered out from all the fun. "Reckon you're ready to head on home?" Miles asked softly, seeing her stroking William's back so gently. Home? That one little word sent a sharp pang right through Margaret's heart. This ranch had started to feel more like home than Redemption Creek ever did, but she knew it was not truly hers. She was just a guest, a charity case, no matter how kind Miles was to her. "I suppose we should," she finally answered. "It has been a wonderful time, but I think William's had about all the excitement he can handle." Miles just nodded, placing a gentle hand on her back to guide her toward their wagon. A few folks called out their goodbyes, including Mrs. Caldwell, who made Margaret promise that she'd come and visit again real soon. The ride back to the ranch was awful quiet, with William sleeping soundly in his mama's arms, and the two of them just lost in their own thoughts. The big old moon was rising high, casting a silver light all over the land and turning the trail ahead of them into a pale, ghostly path. "Did you have a good time tonight?" Miles finally asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Oh, very much," Margaret told him with a smile. Everyone was just so kind and welcoming. Miles glanced over at her. Even Rebecca? Margaret paused for a second. She seemed mighty interested in you. A soft chuckle escaped him. Not in the way you're thinking. Rebecca and we kept company for a little while, about 2 years back. It just did not work out. Do you mind if I ask why? The question slipped out before Margaret could stop herself. Oh, I am sorry. That is none of my business. It's all right, Miles said, his voice calm. Nothing too dramatic. She wanted a husband who would move to town, take over her daddy's business. And I am just not a town man. Never will be. Margaret took that in for a moment. Well, she is very pretty. Yes, she is, Miles agreed simply. Then after a long moment he added, but she's not the one for me. Those words just hung there in the air, heavy with a meaning that neither one of them was quite ready to touch. And Margaret found herself wondering just what kind of woman would be the one for a man like Miles, and wondered if she could ever be that kind of woman. As their wagon reached the top of the last hill before the ranch, the cabin finally came into sight, with a single lantern glowing in the window, just where Miles had left it burning to welcome them home. It looked so welcoming and peaceful, just how a real home ought to feel. Thank you for today, Margaret said in a quiet voice. For the new dress, the dancing, for all of it. The moonlight caught the strong line of Miles' face as he guided the horses on down the slope. No need to thank me. I had a good time myself. More than I reckoned I would, to tell you the truth. When they got to the cabin, Miles helped Margaret down, his hands feeling strong and steady at her waist. For just a second, they stood there close, with little William sleeping soundly between them. The night was quiet, except for the gentle sound of the horses and the far-off hoot of an owl. Margaret, Miles started to say, his voice low and a little unsure, but whatever he was about to say was cut short when William stirred in his sleep and let out a little cry. Just like that, the moment was gone. Margaret took a step back, shifting her hold on her son. I ought to get this little fella to bed, she said, her voice a bit shaky. Good night, Miles. Good night, he answered, just watching as she walked on into the cabin. As Margaret laid William gently in his cradle, she was keenly aware of every sound Miles made outside, tending to the horses. Her feelings for him were getting stronger with every passing day, turning into something much deeper than just being grateful. But she was still a widow, still relying on his kindness, and still so unsure about what her future held. She just could not afford to mistake his good heart for something more, or to risk the safe place they had found here by wanting something more. And yet, as she got ready for bed, Margaret could not stop thinking about the way Miles had looked right at her while they were dancing, or the warmth of his hand on her waist out there in the moonlight. For the very first time since Patrick's passing, she let herself dream of a future that held more than just safety for her and William, but maybe, just maybe, some happiness and even love. September rolled in, bringing cooler weather and a gentle change to the way of life at the Sutton Ranch. Miles was busy spending his long days getting ready for winter, was all about mending fences, stacking firewood, and making sure the barn was sealed up tight against the weather. Margaret, she took charge of putting up the garden's last harvest, filling that root cellar with jars of vegetables and fruits. Little William was growing like a weed, now pulling himself up on the furniture and just babbling away. His first tooth finally popped through, and Lord, was Margaret relieved after a few fussy nights. Miles, he'd gone and carved him some wooden toys, a little horse, a bear, and a simple wagon that William drug all over the cabin floor with the most serious and happy look on his face. Something between Miles and Margaret had started to change a bit since that Founder's Day celebration. You could just feel it in the air, the way Miles's hand might rest a second too long when he passed her a dish, or how Margaret would find herself just watching him while he was out working in the yard. Neither one of them said a word about it, but it was there hanging in the air, a kind of promise that neither was quite ready to put a name to. Then one crisp morning, Miles said he needed to ride out to the north pasture and check on a stretch of fence before the first snow flew. I ought to be back by sundown, he told Margaret as he was finishing up his breakfast. Don't you worry now, Margaret nodded, her mind already on the day's chores. You be careful out there. That weather's turning. Miles just smiled at her, worrying over him. Always am. He paused a moment, then said, was thinking maybe tomorrow we could take a ride up to the falls. Weather ought to hold, and it's real pretty this time of year with all the leaves changing color. Margaret thought back to what Rebecca had said at the celebration. The falls, the ones you used to go to with Rebecca. Miles looked a little uncomfortable for a second. It don't belong to nobody. It's just a beautiful place is all. Seeing he was uneasy, Margaret gave him a warm smile. I would love to see it, and William would surely enjoy the adventure. You could see the relief wash over Miles's face. Good, we'll make a whole day of it. He stood up, putting on his hat and his coat. See y'all this evening. As the day wore on, Margaret found herself looking forward to their little trip, more excited than she ever expected. She got a stew going for supper, letting it simmer real slow so it'd be perfect when he got home. Whenever Miles got back and baked some fresh bread to go with us. But as the afternoon dragged on into evening, and the sun started dipping low with still no sign of Miles, Margaret started to get a real bad feeling. She fed little William and put him down for the night. Then she started pacing back and forth by the window, her eyes glued to the trail for any sign of life. When it got pitch black outside and Miles still was not home, Margaret's concern turned into pure gut-twisting worry. It just was not like him to be late without sending word. What if he was hurt? What if his horse had bucked him off? That north pasture was a long way from anywhere if he was in trouble. He could be lying out there all alone as the night got colder and colder. By 9 o'clock, Margaret knew what she had to do. She could not leave William all by himself to go searching, but she could not just sit there and hope for the best either. Wrapping the sleeping baby up good and tight, she carried him out to the barn where she saddled up Willow. Miles had been teaching her how to ride. It was a real struggle, seeing as she had never saddled a horse by herself before, but she was determined. With William tucked safely against her chest in a sling and a lantern in one hand, Margaret headed out toward the north pasture, following the trail Miles had told her about that morning. The night was clear as a bell, but cold, with stars glittering up above and a half moon giving just enough light to help her lantern along. She rode slow and careful, thinking about keeping William safe and about her own shaky riding skills. Please be all right, she whispered, not knowing if she was praying to the good Lord or just talking to Miles himself. She had ridden maybe 2 miles when all of a sudden, Willow let out a little nicker, her ears perking right up. Just a second later, Margaret heard another horse nicker back, and then she saw the glow of another lantern coming through the trees. Margaret, a voice called out, and it was Miles. He sounded surprised and worried all at once. What in the world are you doing out here? A wave of relief just washed right over her as he came into the light, sitting tall on his stallion and looking perfectly fine. You did not come home, she said, suddenly feeling a little bit silly. I got to worrying that something had happened. Miles nudged his horse on up until they were right there side by side. In the warm glow of the lantern, she could see all sorts of feelings on his face. He looked concerned, a little confused, and something else, something warmer she could not quite put a name to. You came all the way out here in the dark with William, just because you were worried about me? His voice was filled with pure astonishment. Margaret just lifted her chin a little. I was. Was that the wrong thing to do? Miles shook his head real slow. No, not wrong at all. Just unexpected. He reached over and gently touched William, who was sound asleep. Is the little fella all right? He is just fine. Slept right through his very first rescue mission. A small smile played on Miles's lips. I am sorry I gave you a scare. That fence was in worse shape than I figured. Well, the fixin' took a bit longer than expected. Then one of the horses got loose, had to go round him up. We should send word back somehow. Are you okay? Margaret asked, her eyes checking him over for any hurts. Right as rain, just bone-tired and hungry. The hard lines on his face softened. It has been a long while since anyone has worried over me, Margaret. It feels nice. That simple confession touched her heart. Well, you best get used to it, she said, trying to sound light. As long as William and I are here on this ranch, you have got someone waiting for you to come on home. The way Miles looked at her changed right then and there. He reached across the gap between their horses and took her gloved hand right in his. Margaret. But whatever he was about to say got cut short by William stirring in his sling, woken up a bit by their voices. Miles gave her hand one firm squeeze, then let it go. "Let's get you two home," he said. "It is getting too cold for the little one to be out here." They rode along side by side, quiet and comfortable, with that moment just hanging in the air between them. Margaret felt Miles right there beside her, solid and steady in the dark. Whatever was about to happen between them would just have to wait. But she had a feeling they had just crossed some kind of line. Back at the ranch house, Miles insisted he take William while Margaret got off her horse. He then carried the sleeping baby on into the cabin while she went to unsaddle Willow. When she finally came inside, she found Miles had already stoked the fire and was warming his hands by the blaze, a thoughtful look on his face. "The stew is still warm," Margaret offered, walking over to the stove. "I bet you are starving." Miles turned around to face her. "Margaret, what you did tonight, that was a brave thing. A little foolish, maybe, but brave. Riding out all alone in the dark. I could not just sit here, not knowing if you were hurt or not," she explained, plain and simple. Miles walked across the room to stand right in front of her. "Nobody has ever done anything like that for me before." The raw honesty in his voice just stirred something deep inside her. Well then, they just did not care enough. Miles raised his hand to gently cup her cheek, his work-roughened fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "I do not reckon I ever knew what it meant to have someone truly care until you and William came into my life." Margaret's heart started to beat a little faster at his touch, and at the warmth she saw in his blue eyes. "Miles." He paused for a moment, then slow-like, giving her every chance to back away, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. It was a kiss so tender it nearly brought tears to her eyes. It was short, almost like he was asking a question, and when he pulled back, his face was filled with uncertainty. "I have been wanting to do that since Founder's Day," he admitted, in a low voice, maybe even before then. Margaret lifted her hand to touch his face, feeling the slight scratch of his 5 o'clock shadow beneath her fingertips. "I have wanted you to." A wave of relief and pure happiness washed over his face. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, with his cheek resting against her hair. They just stood there like that for a good long while, perfectly content to be in each other's arms. "I am not much for words, Margaret," Miles finally said. "Never have been. But I need you to know that what I feel for you, well, it is the real deal. It is not about gratitude or feeling like I owe you. It is something more." Margaret pulled back just enough to look up into his eyes. "I feel it too. But Miles, I am still a widow. William and I, we are still living on your kindness. That just makes things complicated." "To heck with complications," Miles said with more fire than she had ever heard from him. "I have spent 10 long years all alone keeping everybody at arm's length. Then you and William show up, and all of a sudden this place feels like a real home, not just a roof over my head." He took both of her hands in his. "I am not asking you for any promises, Margaret. Just a chance. A chance for us to see where this whole thing might go." The pure honesty in his eyes and the earnest sound of his voice melted away the last of Margaret's doubts. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I would like that very much." Miles's smile was as bright as the morning sun as he bent to kiss her again, this time with a whole lot more confidence. Margaret kissed him back, letting herself finally enjoy the warmth and the strength of him, the gentle feel of his lips on hers, and the feeling that this was just right, a feeling that wrapped around them both. When they finally pulled apart, Miles rested his forehead right against hers. "I reckon I ought to eat that stew before it gets cold," he said real soft, "and you need to get yourself some rest. It's been one long night." Margaret just nodded, even though she did not rightly want the moment to end. "Our trip to the falls tomorrow is still on, right?" "You bet it is," Miles confirmed, "though maybe with a little less fuss than tonight's adventure." Margaret let out a soft laugh. A person can sure hope. As she got herself ready for bed, she peeked in on William, who was still sleeping, sound as a dollar. Margaret felt a lightness in her heart she had not felt in years. Now, the future still had its question marks. But for the first time since Patrick passed, she was actually looking forward to it with a hopeful heart instead of a heavy one. And if the way Miles had looked at her and held her was anything to go by, that future might just be brighter than she had ever dared to dream. The falls, well, they were even prettier than Margaret had ever pictured. A whole cascade of clear water just tumbling down a set of rocky ledges into a pool, with aspen trees all around turned golden for the fall. The sound of that rushing water filled the air, making everything peaceful for their picnic on the grassy bank. Little William was just fascinated by everything around him, crawling all over the blanket Miles had laid out and trying to grab anything he could get his little hands on. Miles had rigged up a little fishing line and was showing the baby boy how to hold it, but William was a whole lot more interested in chewing on the stick than learning how to fish. He will get the hang of it in a few years, Miles chuckled, gently taking the stick out of William's mouth for the third time. Margaret watched the two of them, and her heart was just so full. The change in Miles since their kiss last night was small, but you could surely see it. A new kind of openness, a lightness about him that made him seem younger. He had been so thoughtful all day, helping her with William, making sure she was comfortable on the ride up here. Little things that said more than words ever could. "A penny for your thoughts," Miles said, seeing her watching them. Margaret could not help but smile. "I was just thinking how natural you are with Finn. You would make a wonderful father." The words just tumbled right out before she could think twice, and she felt a hot blush creep up her neck. But Miles did not seem fazed one bit. "Well, I sure hope to have that chance someday," he said, real simple-like, his eyes holding hers steady. That moment was heavy with things left unsaid. Margaret looked away first, feeling a little overwhelmed by where her own mind was wandering. It all felt like too much, too soon, and just too darn complicated. But Lord, she could not deny how right it felt, just sitting here with Miles and William, like they were already her own family. "Tell me about the ranch in the wintertime," she said, steering the conversation to safer waters. "Does it get real harsh?" Miles accepted the change of topic as smooth as you please. "It can be. The snow piles up deep. Temperatures drop below zero sometimes, but this old cabin is built solid, and we have got a whole mess of firewood stacked high. The cattle know how to hunker down in the worst of it." "And you? Do you all go into town much during the winter, less than in summer? The roads can get plumb impassable. Christmas over at the Caldwell's place is about the only visiting I am obligated to do." He looked at her. "But I reckon this winter is going to be different, having you and William around." Margaret nodded, her mind already on the cold months to come. "I have never been through a Montana winter. Does it get awful lonesome?" "It can," Miles admitted honestly, "but there is a real beauty in it, too. The quiet, the whole world covered in clean white snow, and the stars so bright on a clear night, it feels like you could just reach up and pluck one from the sky." He paused for a second. "Are you worried about being snowed in with just me for company?" The way he asked, so full of concern, went straight to her heart. "No," she told him, meaning every word. "Not one bit. I am just trying to get my mind right for it. Back in Boston, winter just meant crowded streets and sooty, cold smoke. In Redemption Creek, it just meant deep mud and more saloon fights than usual." Miles let out a soft chuckle at that. "Well, I can promise you nothing but clean air and a whole lot of peace out here. Though I cannot make any promises, little William will not get cabin fever." "Oh, we will manage," Margaret said with confidence. "He is a tough and adaptable little fella." And as if to prove her right, William picked that exact moment to give up on his fishing stick and start crawling like he was on a mission for the edge of the blanket, drawn by a butterfly that was flittering by him. Miles just reached over and scooped him right up before he could get into the damp grass. "Whoa there, little partner," he said, getting the baby settled on his lap. "Let's not go taking a swim just yet." William fussed just a little, then got sidetracked by Miles' watch chain, and he got real serious about looking it over. Miles smiled down at the pig and Michelle at the boy, then looked up to find Margaret watching them with a look on her face that made his heart do a little jump. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low. "Just you," she answered. "The way you are with him, the way you look right about now." Miles's whole face just softened. "Happy because I truly am, Margaret. Happier than I've been in more years than I can count." The simple truth in his words touched her something deep. Letting go of her worries, Margaret scooted closer till she was right beside him on the blanket, their shoulders just barely touching. Miles moved William to sit right between them, and then he gently put his arm around Margaret's waist. They just sat like that for a good long while, watching the light dance on the waterfall and listening to William's happy little noises, just enjoying being together without saying a word. It was a perfect moment, one Margaret knew she'd hold on to no matter what the future might bring. After a bit, little William's eyelids started getting heavy, the big day finally wearing him out. Margaret cradled him close as he drifted off to sleep, his little body all warm against hers. "We ought to head on back," Miles said, though he didn't seem to want to break the magic of the afternoon. "We don't want to be caught on the trail after dark." So they packed up their picnic, and Miles made extra sure that the blanket was wrapped up good and snug around William before helping Margaret onto her horse. The ride back to the ranch was quiet and peaceful, with all the fall colors in the trees and the late afternoon sun making long shadows across the path. Just as they came over the last hill before the ranch house came into sight, Miles pulled his horse up right next to Margaret's. "Thank you for coming out here with me today," he told her. "This place has always been real special to me, but sharing it with you and William, well, that means more than I can ever say." Margaret gave him a warm smile, knowing exactly what he was trying to tell her. "It's a magical place, Miles. Thank you for showing it to us." Miles took a breath. Then he finally asked the question that had been weighing on him all day long. "Margaret, would you think about staying? I don't just mean for the winter, I mean for good." Well, that question hit her right out of the blue. "Miles, I know it's awful soon," he said, talking fast now. "I know you're still hurting over Patrick and still trying to get your bearings. But I just need y'all to know there's a home for you here, for both of you, for as long as you want it." Margaret just looked at him, this good and decent man who had quite literally pulled her and William out of a terrible spot, who'd opened up his home and little by little his heart to them, who looked at her boy with a kindness that just made her heart ache. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," she said, choosing her words with care, "but I do know that being here with you feels right, more right than anything has in a long, long time." Miles just nodded, understanding that was all she could give him for now. "That's enough for me." As they rode on down to the cabin, Margaret couldn't help but picture more days just like this one, with picnics down by the falls and quiet evenings by the fire, watching William grow up strong and happy in this beautiful land, with Miles right there beside her through it all. His quiet strength was like solid ground she could finally build on. It was still too soon for making promises or being certain of anything. But for the first time since that auctioneer's hammer came down, sending her and William to what she'd feared would be a life of nothing but hard work, or worse, Margaret Flynn let herself dream of being happy, a real, true happiness with Miles Sutton. Well, winter came down on those Montana highlands faster than a blink. One day the hills were all lit up with fall colors, and the very next a mean old storm blew in from up north, leaving 6 inches of snow behind and turning the whole place into a quiet, white wonderland. More snow kept coming, and by early December, that ranch was pretty much cut off from town. Lest you were on horseback, on the most direct trails. But Miles, he had prepared well, making sure they had plenty of supplies, a whole lot of firewood, and feed for all the animals. The cattle had already been moved down to the south pastures, where the land gave them natural shelter and breaks from the wind, protecting them from the worst of the weather. The barn was all snug and the cabin was warmer than ever. Just as Margaret had hoped, thanks to Miles keeping that big stone fireplace in tip-top shape, and that smaller stove in the bedroom where she and little William slept. Life fell into a new kind of rhythm, one set by the shorter days, and the tough work of keeping the ranch going in such harsh weather. Miles was up before the sun every morning, checking on the livestock and breaking the ice on the water troughs. He would come back inside for breakfast with a fine dusting of snow on his coat and hat. Margaret kept the home fires burning, and I mean that for real, all while taking care of William. She was also cooking up warm, hearty meals to chase away the biting cold. Little William, now 9 months old, was pulling himself up on furniture and scooting along the edges. He was just so eager to explore his little world, even with the limits of being stuck indoors. Mostly cooped up inside, Miles had built him a small playpen. He set it up near the fireplace, where the boy could play safely while Margaret got her work done, though both of them were constantly picking up toys that William would happily throw right out of it, far beyond its little fence. Then one evening, around the middle of December, a real nasty blizzard started howling around the cabin, the wind searching out every single crack. It found every nook and cranny, no matter how hard Miles had worked to weatherproof the place. Margaret had just put William down for the night, after a long day of trying to keep him entertained. Stuck inside and all, she came and sat with Miles by the fire, where he was busy mending a piece of tack. "This storm's a bad one," he said, glancing up as she sat down. "I figure it might last clear through tomorrow." Margaret just nodded, settling into the old rocking chair, the one right across from him. William was fussy all day long. "I think he can feel the storm coming." Or maybe, she added, "he is just tired of being cooped up." "Can't blame him for that," Miles said. He had a small smile on his face. "Cabin fever sets in mighty early when you're that little. And full of so much energy. Were you able to check on all the cattle today?" Margaret asked, seeing the tired lines etched around his eyes. Miles gave a slow nod. "They're all hunkered down in the south draw. They ought to be fine." He set his work aside. He stretched his arms out wide, and his shoulders popped loud enough to hear. "Spring will be here. Before we know it," he said. Margaret smiled at him, trying to sound so hopeful. "You mean we only have 3 more months of winter?" He let out a soft chuckle. "Something like that." They sat there in a comfortable quiet for a little while, just listening to the storm, wind, and the pop and crackle of the fire. Over the past few weeks, they had grown more comfortable with each other, their bond growing stronger in small, meaningful ways. Miles would just reach for her hand as they sat by the fire in the evenings. Margaret would gently touch his shoulder as she walked past his chair, or brush the snow from his hair when he came in from the cold. They had shared more kisses too, some quick and sweet, others deeper and full of promise. But Miles was a gentleman, careful not to push for more, respecting that she was still a recent widow and the delicate spot they were in. "Christmas is only a week away," Margaret said softly, breaking the comfortable quiet. "Do you think we'll be able to get to town for the Caldwell's party, if this weather keeps up?" Miles thought on it a minute. "Well, if it clears in the next day or two, the trail ought to be clear enough by Christmas Eve. If not," he shrugged, "we might just have to have our own celebration right here." Margaret nodded, trying her best not to show her disappointment. She had really been looking forward to the get-together, both for little William's sake and for the chance to see the new friends she had made in Whitefish Creek. "I reckon William won't know the difference. And Lord knows there's plenty to be thankful for right here." Miles just watched her face in the firelight. "You miss folks, don't you?" "Being around other people sometimes," she admitted. "Not like back in Redemption Creek. I sure don't miss the gossip or the judging eyes, but friendly faces, a good conversation." "Yes, I do miss that from time to time." Miles was quiet for a moment. "Is it awful hard on you, being out here with just me and William to keep you company?" The question showed a tender spot Margaret had come to see in him, a worry that his quiet way of life might not be enough for her. She got up from her chair and knelt down beside his, taking his strong, weathered hands in her own. "No, Miles, it is not hard at all. In fact, these past few months have been the most peaceful, the most content I have felt in a long, long time." She looked right up at him, wanting him to see the truth in her eyes. "Being here with you has been a blessing I never saw coming." The worry just melted from his face. He raised one hand to gently touch her cheek. "I feel the same way, Margaret. Having you and William here, it's everything." It had changed everything. The gentleness in his touch, the warmth in his eyes, gave Margaret a bit of courage. She rose up just a little, leaned in and kissed him, pouring all the feelings she had been holding back so carefully for weeks. Miles answered right back, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her up until she was sitting right across his lap, and their kiss grew deeper, more urgent than any they had ever shared before. Margaret's hands found their way to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength of him right through his woolen shirt. His own fingers got tangled up in her hair, which she had left down and loose after her bath. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Miles just rested his forehead against hers, his eyes shut tight like he was saving the moment. "Margaret," he whispered, her name like a soft touch on his lips. "I know," she answered softly. I feel it too. He opened his eyes and their blue depths were dark with feeling. I love you. I have for a while now, probably since that night you came riding out to find me. Maybe even before that. He said it plain and simple, without any fancy words, but with a sincerity so deep it filled Margaret's heart with joy. I love you too, Miles. So much it scares me sometimes. A smile of pure, honest happiness spread right across his face. It does. Why? She had a hard time putting her fears into words. Because I never reckoned I would feel this way again. Not after Patrick. After everything, I truly thought that part of my life was done for. And then there is William and this whole situation of ours. But Miles quieted her with a gentle finger on her lips. Margaret Flynn, I love you. And I love William like he was my own flesh and blood. Nothing else in this world matters to me, except that you two are safe and happy. He took a deep breath. I want to build a life with you, a real one. Not this temporary setup we have been pretending is good enough. Margaret's heart started beating fast at his words. Miles, what are you trying to say? He moved just a little, reaching into his pocket and pulling out something small. I have been carrying this around for weeks now, just waiting for the right time. He opened up his hand, and there sat a simple gold band with a little diamond. It was my mother's. I would be mighty honored if you would wear it. Margaret just stared at the ring, and then back at Margaret's face, hardly daring to believe what was happening. Miles, are you truly asking? Margaret Flynn, will you marry me? Be my wife. Let me be a father to William. Help me make this ranch a true home for all of us. Tears filled Margaret's eyes as pure happiness welled up inside her. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Miles Sutton, I will marry you. With hands that trembled just a bit, Miles slipped the ring right onto her finger. It fit like it had been made just for her. He kissed her again, a kiss that was full of promise and passion, and a future that was suddenly as clear as a summer sky. When they parted, Margaret stayed right there in his embrace, her head resting against his shoulder. When? She asked simply. Miles took a moment to think. Well, spring would be practical, easier for folks to travel for the wedding, but I would marry you tomorrow if we could get ourselves to town. Margaret smiled against his shirt. Spring sounds perfect. The snow will be all gone and the flowers will be blooming. A new beginning. A new beginning, Miles echoed, his voice rich with contentment. For all of us. They sat there together by the fire as the blizzard raged on outside, talking of plans and dreams of a future that neither one had imagined was possible just a few months before. Miles spoke of expanding the ranch, building a larger bedroom for William as he grew, and maybe adding more rooms if their family was to expand. Would you want that? He asked, a little hesitant, at more children. Margaret's heart swelled at the hope she heard in his voice. I would, very much. William ought to have brothers and sisters to grow up with. Miles's arms tightened around her. I never figured I would have a family of my own. Not after the war, after everything I saw and did, I just did not think I deserved one. Margaret raised her head to look right at him. Oh, Miles, if any man deserves happiness, it is you. You are the most honorable, the kindest man I have ever known. He kissed her again, gently this time. Thank you for seeing something in me worth loving. Thank you for saving us that day in Redemption Creek, she replied softly. For giving us a home when we had none. Best thing I ever did, Miles said with absolute conviction. Riding into that auction might have looked like an act of charity to others, but it was the most selfish thing I have ever done. I saved myself. That day, Margaret, you and little William, y'all saved me from a life of loneliness I didn't even rightly know I had until you showed me what I was missing. The deep down gratitude in his voice stirred something in Margaret. She had never once considered that she and William might have given Miles just as much as he had given to them. Knowing that just seemed to set things right between them in a way that felt honest and true. As the night wore on, they hated to part ways, with Miles heading to his loft and Margaret to the bedroom that she shared with her boy William. But a new understanding of it settled between them, a promise that went deeper than the ring now shining on Margaret's finger. Come spring, they would be a true family, not just in their hearts, but in name too. And that knowledge made the howling winter storm outside seemed like nothing more than a little bump in the road on the way to the life they'd build together. That Christmas season at the Sutton Ranch was unlike any Margaret had ever known before. Since they were unable to get to town because of the continuing bad weather, they made their own celebration, quiet and full of heart. Miles cut a small pine from the edge of the woods and set it up right there in the cabin, and Margaret decorated it with paper ornaments she'd made during William's naps. They strung popcorn on a thread and used pine cones dipped in flour paste to look like they were covered in snow, making for a simple but charming sight. Little William was just mesmerized by the tree, trying to crawl toward it at every chance he got, until Miles built a small barrier to keep him at a safe distance. Miles had carved a whole set of wooden animals for William's Christmas gift: a horse, a cow, a sheep, and a bear, each one smooth and sized just perfectly for his small hands. Margaret had knitted Miles a warm scarf from yarn she'd found tucked away in an old trunk, working on it secretly in the evenings after he'd gone on up to his loft. As for Margaret, Miles had ridden out all by himself one clear morning and came back with a package wrapped up real careful in oilcloth. On Christmas morning, once little William was completely lost in his new toys, Miles handed her the gift, looking unusually shy. "It is not much," he mumbled as she unwrapped it, "and if you do not like it, I promise I won't be offended." Inside was a little painting set in a hand-carved frame, a picture of the falls where they'd had their picnic, with all the fall colors captured with a skill that truly surprised her. Margaret let out a little gasp of delight. "Oh, Miles, it is just beautiful. Did you paint this yourself?" He just nodded, a touch of red creeping up his cheeks. "You used to draw some before the war." "Picked it back up this fall. I figured you might like a little something to remember that day." "I absolutely love it," Margaret told him, her heart warmed by such a personal gift. "I had no idea you were an artist." Miles just shrugged, a little embarrassed by all the praise. "Well, I wouldn't go that far. It is just something I enjoy from time to time." Margaret hung the little painting on the wall right next to the fireplace, where she could see it from her favorite rocking chair. It brought a nice bit of color and warmth into the cabin, but more than that, it showed a whole other side of Miles. She was just starting to see a gentle side that balanced out his tough exterior. The days between Christmas and New Year's just drifted by in a peaceful haze. Margaret spent her time writing letters to the few friends she had made in Whitefish Creek, telling them all about the engagement, while Miles was busy making plans to expand the garden and maybe even the cabin itself come springtime. Meanwhile, William kept up his determined efforts to walk, even managing to stand all by himself for a few moments before plopping right back down onto the wood floor with a look of pure, stubborn determination that made both of the grown-ups laugh out loud. On New Year's Eve, long after William was tucked in and fast asleep, Miles opened a bottle of wine he had been saving for just the right time. They sat there in front of the fire, glasses in hand, thinking back on the incredible year that was finally coming to a close. "You know, if someone had told me last New Year's what this year was going to bring, I would have never in a million years believed them," Margaret said, the firelight catching the little diamond on her finger as she talked with her hands. "So very much has changed." Miles nodded, his face thoughtful. "For the better, I sure hope." "Oh, absolutely for the better," she told him with a smile, as she reached out for his hand. "Even with everything that happened, with Patrick's passing, the auction, all of it, I cannot help but feel truly blessed. William is healthy and so happy. We have a good home and we have a future." She squeezed his fingers gently. "And I found you." Miles gently lifted her hand and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. "I have been thinking about our wedding day," he said. "If the weather holds, I figure we could aim for April. The worst of the mud season, well, that ought to be over by then, but before the real hard work with the cattle kicks off." Margaret just nodded, her heart feeling full. "April sounds absolutely perfect. Nothing too fancy, just our family and close friends. We could have Reverend Thomas lead the service." "That is a fine idea," Miles continued. "And you know, Mrs. Caldwell already offered up her beautiful garden for the party whenever we picked the day." "You already talked to her about it?" Margaret asked, completely surprised. Miles got a little sheepish look on his face. "I might have mentioned what I was planning to do when I was in town, buying your ring back in October." Margaret let out a happy laugh, just delighted by the news. So, you have been planning this all for months. Since about a week after you first showed up, Miles admitted with a big old grin. I tried to be patient, I really did. The very thought of Miles carrying that ring around for months, just waiting for the perfect moment to ask her, it just warmed Margaret's soul. She leaned forward and kissed him, ever so softly. She felt a connection so deep, a love so pure. Thank you for being so patient with me and for making this all come true. I swear I could not imagine a better man to start this next part of our lives with. They kept on talking, sharing all their dreams and their hopes for the future with the fire crackling beside them. And for the first time in so many long years, Margaret truly believed that happiness was finally hers to hold. As the grandfather clock in the hall struck midnight, they raised their glasses to the new year and to the bright future ahead of them, finally together as a family with one heart, one purpose, and a love that would never fade.